Well, good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the 23rd meeting of the Public Audit Committee in 2025. We've received apologies this morning from Joe Fitzpatrick, but we are going to be joined online by his substitute, who is Stephanie Callaghan. The first item for the committee to consider is whether to take agenda items 4 and 5 in private this morning. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. And the main item on our agenda this morning is further consideration of the Auditor General for Scotland's report on the Scottish National Investment Bank, which came out earlier this year. We've previously taken evidence from representatives of the bank and before that the Auditor General and his team. This morning we're joined by Scottish Government representatives to give us their views on the report and to answer the questions that we've got. So I'm pleased to welcome to the committee this morning Gregor Irwin, who's the Director General for Economy. Alongside Mr Irwin this morning is Richard Rawlinson, who is the Director of International Trade and Investment. And we're also joined by Andy Hogg, who's the Deputy Director of Investment and Financial Services at the Scottish Government. As I said, we've got a number of questions to put to you, Director General, but before we get to those, I'd like to invite you to give us a short opening statement.
Good morning, Convener, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee this morning. As you've noted, I'm joined by Richard Rawlinson, our Director for International Trade and Investment. Richard has been the Portfolio Director responsible for the Scottish National Investment Bank since April 2021 and is the Government's observer on the bank's boards. I'm also joined by Andy Hogg, Deputy Director for Investment and Financial Services. Andy leads the Scottish Government shareholder team and works with our Exchequer and Finance colleagues on matters relating to the bank's financial and budgetary arrangements. At the outset, let me thank the Auditor General and his team for their report. It offers both clear recommendations and a valuable assessment of the bank's role in Scotland's investment landscape. The report highlights the important role that SNIB now plays in our economy and the strong rationale for its operational independence. It also observes that long-term patient capital investment will inevitably result in some losses alongside investment gains. I welcome the Auditor General's conclusion that the bank has strong governance and clear accountability arrangements. I also welcome the recognition that the Scottish Government's oversight strikes the right balance between scrutiny and allowing the bank's operational independence to enable it to pursue its missions. Now, the report makes 5 recommendations, 3 for government and 2 for the bank itself. Of the recommendations for government, we've already implemented 2 of those and work is underway on the 3rd, which relates to the UK Government's Public Finance Institutions Framework and the plan for the bank to become a perpetual investment fund. And of course, my colleagues and I can provide more detail on this work during today's session. Finally, I'd just like to note that the bank's chair has already confirmed to the committee that work is in hand to address the 2 recommendations which were directed at the bank. So we, of course, look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, those recommendations then, I take it, Director General, you accept in full each of those recommendations that have been made in the report? Yes, you do. Right, thank you, thank you. Can I turn then to one of those which is a recommendation for you, and that is to ensure that the Business Investment Group is up and running and working effectively. Could you give us an update on where you have got to with that?
Yes, so we accept that recommendation. As I've said, we have established what is called the Business Investment Coordination Group. And the role of that group is to identify market gaps, trends in the investment landscape, to share information and product development, to provide general updates and to ensure a cohesive approach by all those public bodies involved in investment in Scotland. It's not a public-facing forum. It's really a sort of working-level group that brings together the most important participants in that system in Scotland. Andy may want to say more about this. Andy chairs that group, the sponsor team for our enterprise agencies. They're involved in, of course, the sponsor team for the bank itself. And the key bodies that participate in that are the bank plus the 3 enterprise agencies. But we do also allow others, invite others to participate, and the group meets on a quarterly basis.
Mr. Hogg, I don't know whether you want to give us some more information about the workings of the Business Investment Group.
Yeah, as Gregor said, the primary function of it is to provide this coordination across key members in each of those organisations across the Scottish National Investment Bank, Scottish Enterprise, Hellas and Ellis Enterprise and South of Scotland Enterprise, with key government departments there to engage and work with them. The group's met 3 times. It met first in February, and understanding the kind of landscape, looking at how the delivery partners can work together and improve efficiencies. Met again in May and had a wider discussion about the changing and evolving landscape across investment in the UK and Scotland. And then most recently it met on the 2nd of September, and that's where we had a deeper dive and a deeper discussion around some of the programme for government commitments around scale up and entrepreneurship and how the public bodies can engage on those and make most impact. At the next meeting, as Gregor says, the group can engage externally as well, so we're planning to bring along counterparts in the British Business Bank so that we can have a wider discussion about interdependencies and ways of working across the system. But it's predominantly to be a useful forum where colleagues can share information and we establish a shared understanding of key areas.
Okay, thank you. I mean, again, just for clarity, Director General, you are the accountable officer in the Scottish Government for the Scottish National Investment Bank. I think you described Mr Rollison as the portfolio director. How does that relationship work? What is your relationship with the Scottish National Investment Bank? Is it simply through delegated authority through Mr Rollison and Mr Hogg?
No, I have direct responsibilities. I have regular meetings with the senior independent director, who's an important part of the governance framework for the Scottish National Investment Bank. And I also have, on a less regular and formal basis, I meet with the chair and the chief executive. And obviously, when you look at my sort of full range of responsibilities beyond my accountable officer responsibilities for the bank itself, there are a number of circumstances in which I will work with the chief executive and his team to pursue the government's objectives.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I'm going to move on shortly, but just one last question. I mean, you said, and I think it's recorded in the Auditor General's report, that the bank is well governed. But he did also say, when he gave evidence to the committee on the 28th of May, that over-governance is a real risk to be managed. I mean, listening to the various bits of apparatus, and I think some of them are described in Exhibit 3 in the report, there is a business investment group, a Scottish Government Ministerial Advisory Group, there's the board of the National Investment Bank itself, there's this figure who acts as an independent oversight and, as you've described it, liaises with... I mean, there potentially is a danger, isn't there, that both at a strategic and even potentially at an operational level, there are lots of cooks who might spoil the broth?
Yes. I think the question here is balance. And the question that it's also important that we comply with legislation, so that ministerial advisory group is something which is required under the Act. Andy or Richard may be able to explain more about the origins for the business investment group that Andy's just been describing. But that was a recommendation from the Auditor General's report. The role of senior independent director is it's unique to the bank in Scotland, but it's a standard practice for financial institutions across the rest of the UK. And of course, the board itself plays a very important role. And I've referred already to the operational independence of the bank, which I think is critically important to the success of the bank, and I'm sure that's something we may come back to subsequently. So I think the key to making, I think I judge that that's a good governance system, but the key to ensuring that it works well is to respect the roles and responsibilities of different parties within that system, while also combining that with an element of pragmatism. But I don't have any concerns about any elements of that system, and I do judge that we've got the balance right.
But you are vigilant, no doubt.
Of course.
Yes. OK, I'm going to invite Graham Simpson to put some questions to you. Graham.
Oh, thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, gents. I just want to, if it's OK, just look at some of the losses that the bank's incurred so far. And obviously, we had what I thought was a very useful session with the bank. And we would accept that, the nature of it, there are going to be losses, and there have been losses. From what I can see, there's been a couple. Circularity Scotland, which we know about, we can come back to that. But there's been one more recent one, M². So what's your understanding of the potential loss there?
So, in the case, first of all, just to agree with your point, I think it is important to recognise just the very nature of what the bank does. It invests in a diversified portfolio to pursue missions agreed with the government. It's required to make a commercial rate of return, but it does take risks, and it provides funding at a relatively early stage, which is riskier, and it does mean almost by necessity that you will invest in some companies that are very successful, and there will be others which are not successful. And I think that's the context in which we need to evaluate the bank's performance. The bank has invested over several tranches of investment, £34 million in M². As you know, administrators have been appointed. They were appointed on the 27th of August. That insolvency process, that's ongoing. We don't yet know what the outcome of that insolvency process will be, and therefore what the implications are for the bank's investment at that stage. But obviously it's been reflected in its approach to provisioning in the accounts which for 24-25.
So is it possible that the taxpayer ultimately, because it's the taxpayer that funds the bank, could we lose all 34 million?
I think it's essential to look at the bank's financial performance in the round because, of course, there will be gains as well as losses. I also think, to come back to this point about operational independence, I think it's important that as you scrutinise and as we scrutinise the performance of the bank, I think there's a risk if we focus too much on individual investments, because there's a risk that that compromises the operational independence of the bank. But specifically in this case, we're not yet able to say what the extent of that loss will be, because the administration process is still underway.
But potentially it could be all 34 million.
There's no point in speculating.
Potentially. I'm not saying it will be. Potentially.
I don't know what the outcome of the administration process will be. I mean,
I think potentially there are losses. Seems to want to say something.
I suppose, Mr Simpson, I'd say potentially there are losses on any investment that is undertaken.
Listen, I completely get that. There are risks, there are rewards, and I'm not obsessing about this one.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I think when you add up the two losses, seem to represent about. If it was the whole 34 million, that would be around about 5%, I think, of the money invested so far by the bank. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
A little bit less, but more.
A little bit less, 4 or 5%. Now, I don't know whether that's an acceptable level or not. It seems quite small, but given that the other companies the bank's invested in, you could get a return on them. That's the nature of it. So I do get that. But I just think it's important that I ask about this particular one because it's quite recent.
Yes.
Yeah. So you'd accept that?
I'd accept that, yes.
So if we've got a level of 4 to 5% of money invested, lost, if you like, is that an acceptable level, or do you have a figure in mind of what you can live with?
Okay. So a couple of things I'd add, Mr Simpson. Firstly, to date, only one loss with the bank has actually been crystallised and impacted on government's budgets, and that is Circularity Scotland Limited. M Squared Lasers, which you're asking about at the minute, that has a provision against it in the accounts, and as Gregor noted, is an administration, so that has to follow that process through. For full transparency, alongside that, there is also Crucial, another company, a smaller scale company, with a 4.6 million investment that has also appointed administrators. Again, hasn't yet any loss crystallised, but the provisions are made against it. In relation to your question around specific losses, we don't have a shareholder view on number of specific losses. What we would point to is the bank being that longer-term patient capital investment, and the fact that Scottish ministers set a target rate of return for that bank over the longer term of between 3% and 4%. So when you balance off losses and gains, we'd expect that sort of level.
Okay. So on Crucial, because I think we were chatting earlier and a bit unclear about whether it had appointed administrators. You're saying it has.
Understanding, yes. Administrators, Crucial's board of directors appointed insolvency advisors on 2nd of June. Staff were advised on the 25th of June, is our understanding.
Okay, right. So that's another potential loss. Only potential?
Only potential. All
right.
are only potential.
Okay. So given that we've had three, well, one definite loss, two potentials, what lessons are you learning from these? You know, about the kind of investments that you make in future, or the bank makes?
Well, I think you've partly answered the question. It's for the bank to make investment decisions. We took some assurance from Audit Scotland's report, which has examined the bank's internal processes and tested their robustness in the bank's decision-making. We think that's important. Richard is an observer on the bank's board. As I've noted, I have a regular formal meeting with the senior independent director. These are opportunities for us to understand and scrutinise the bank's internal processes as well, without getting involved in individual investment decision-making processes. There will also be the 5-year review that will be conducted into the operations of the bank, and that will provide an opportunity to examine the bank's success against that target rate of return which Andy's referred to, of 3 to 4%. So that will provide an opportunity to take a step back, to look across the portfolio and to look across a significant period of operation from the bank without focusing too much on one individual investment or one moment in time.
Perhaps just to add, so as the observer at the board, what I can give you assurance of is that the board look very, at length and very seriously at their portfolio of investments through the valuation committee up to the board, and at every board meeting they're looking at all of their investments in their portfolio as a whole, and particularly at the ones that you might see maybe at risk.
Okay. So,
one other point I would note is that the bank also continually keeps its investment strategy under review. Yeah. So some of these investments actually we're talking about here were ones made quite early in the bank's establishment. Okay. Subsequent to some of these, the bank has updated its investment strategy, as an example, and a couple of the things the bank have changed in that, for example, are requiring a higher level of technology readiness. So they've increased the TRL level, and also things like requiring greater experience and capacity at management team level. So the bank keep this sort of thing under review at operational level about what they believe to be robust investments, I think. And they publish all that as part of an investment strategy.
Well, that's interesting. So would you say they're taking, shall we describe it as less risky investments now?
I would consider that to be largely an operational decision for the bank. We would require they publish the information in the strategy.
I think it's probably important to distinguish between the controls around risk and the risk tolerance of the bank. That would be my only observation.
Okie doke. So probably the most high-profile loss. I'm sorry to keep focusing on losses, but I'll ask about the other side in a minute. Was Circularity Scotland, and when Willie Watt was here, I asked him if he'd underestimated the sort of politicisation of the deposit return scheme, and he said that they probably had. I'm paraphrasing. Do you think there were, do you think there were lessons there for the bank and even for the government in such a scheme, because it was highly political?
So Al Denham, as the Chief Executive Officer, he conducted an investigation into that particular investment, and he, as part of that investigation, he considered whether the bank had followed its own processes. He reported to the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee on the outcome of that investigation in 2023. He noted then that the bank would draw lessons, including in its approach to risks relating to legislation. And he concluded from his review that there were a number of what I think he referred to as macro factors, which are important in making an investment decision of that sort, such as, for example, the prevalence of deposit return schemes worldwide. I think he specifically noted that they regarded the fact that there were similar policy frameworks adopted by UK government, Welsh government and Scottish government regarding deposit return scheme as a risk mitigant. But the bank also acknowledged that they perhaps underestimated, I'm paraphrasing their words, not mine, the extent to which a decision-making process of that sort could become political, as you've suggested.
Yeah. I think they've learned their lesson, had their fingers burnt, so hopefully that won't happen again. So, right, I've been a bit negative, so let's talk about the positives. Are there any success stories here that you'd like to highlight?
Yes, so I think it's important to recognise the role that the bank is playing in a number of different areas. I think the bank has played a leading role as investing its own core funding, but also as a delivery partner for the offshore wind investment programme, with a particular focus, as is understandable at this early stage, in port infrastructure. I draw your attention to Ardersier Port in particular, which is a massive investment and which represents a massive expansion in port infrastructure in Scotland and capacity to accommodate supply chain manufacturing in the offshore wind sector. I think the fact that the bank has collaborated with the National Well Fund in co-investing there is also a good example. Of course, there's still a way to go in terms of the development of Ardersier ports, but that is a hugely ambitious operation. More recently, Zero Avia, I think there's another good example there of the bank doing something different, not investing in infrastructure as such, but investing in a highly innovative company which has tremendous potential to succeed, but which is also part of the net zero transition. So Zero Avia is a developer and manufacturer of zero emissions engines for commercial aviation. They signed an agreement, the Scottish Power, to develop low carbon hydrogen supply for key airport locations, and that's really important for the future of the aviation sector in Scotland, as well as being an exciting commercial prospect. And I think it's a really good example of mission aligning with, yes, a risky investment, because all investment is risky, but a calibrated risk undertaken investing in a company which potentially has a very good commercial future. I think it also draw your attention, finally, this is the last example I'll give, to the role that the bank is playing in the housing sector. It's undertaken a number of investments in the housing sector, some quite micro investments, but very important in the locations where they occur. Others larger scale thriving investments, being an example where they're essentially acting as an anchor for a larger fund, leveraging in private sector finance, so playing a really important role as part of the work across government to support the housing sector.
Okay, that's great. They're very good examples. I'm particularly excited about Zero Avia. One final question from me, convener. Actually, you mentioned housing, and at the last session we were looking at other models, other development banks around the world. And there was a brief discussion about the KfW Development Bank in Germany, and that's been around for 80 years. They do a lot in public housing, so that's one model. We looked at the Connecticut Green Bank. That helps to fund net zero projects in that state. I mean, have you looked at other models, considered other models around the world to learn from them?
Yes, I wonder if I might turn to Andy, who might be able to say a bit more about that. We're certainly familiar with the first example that you gave there. I think also, we pay close attention to how similar institutions in the UK, how they're evolving, and that includes the Development Bank of Wales, for example. So that there are some good examples close to home as well as those international examples. But Andy, is there anything you might add specifically on KfW?
Yeah, specifically in KfW, I think the bank's chair raised that, particularly in relation to its ability to both recycle funds and demonstrate some of those perpetual activities that the bank would like to have here. Obviously, much larger scale international bank that's been established since 1948, KfW, so it's been around a long time with a huge capital base, and it borrows in markets as well. So very different organisation from the bank, which was only established in 2020. But I think the point the chair was raising at that time was that compatibility, about the potential things that it could do. But I think we've got quite an active dialogue with a lot of the other banks. So colleagues in the shareholder team meet with other devolved governments, such as Wales, to explore what is happening in the Development Banking of Wales. The bank meet with counterparts in the British Business Bank, the National Wealth Fund, Development Bank of Wales, to build those connections. So I think there is quite an active horizon scanning around what opportunities there might be. And going back to your point about housing, the bank's recent the kind of commitments against the bank in the recent Housing Emergency Action Plan. That's an example of the bank taking a more active market creation role, looking at different activities and ways of working to unlock potential investments there, which might not be as simple as just a single investment opportunity coming at the door. They've got a role in structuring and defining some of that. So that's an important area where the bank is evolving its approach.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. You were asked about positive examples, and you spoke about the renewable sector, and you went on to cite the Port Ardisia. I mean, that is being driven by Quantum Capital Group, isn't it, which is headquartered in Houston, Texas. And we had some discussions with Mr Denham and Mr Watt about covenants and trying to lock in Scottish ownership and control. I suppose my question is, what's the balance that's been struck in the renewable sector, for example, between indigenous businesses that are invested in and foreign direct investment projects like Ardisia?
Yes, so again, I think you need to look across the portfolios. So the bank has undertaken a number of investments in ports across Scotland under Scottish ownership, under various types of ownership, but certainly in many cases under Scottish ownership.
In ports, Mr Irwin?
Yes, there are. When you look across the
Aberdeen,
okay,
Key as an example.
Yeah, okay.
So there's a range of ownership structures for those ports. I think it's essential that the bank undertakes different types of investment, and I think one of the things that we're looking for when the bank invests is the extent to which it's able to bring in private private investment alongside it to leverage the impact of the bank. And that's that may be important in terms of commercial returns, but it's certainly important in terms of impact and the missions that the bank has. And there are advantages from bringing in investors that bring knowledge and expertise to particular sectors and may be able to bring access to opportunities that might not be otherwise available. So without wanting to focus on specific investors, as part of that process that the bank goes through, I would certainly hope that they would be looking very carefully at the partners that they are working with and what they bring to that opportunity and what that means in terms of the bank's ability to have impact. The bank, when you look at other parts of its portfolio, including many of the companies that it's invested in, of course, again, they will have other investors, some of which may be international, some of which will be Scottish-based, but very often we're talking about Scottish companies that have started up in Scotland or scaling up in Scotland. Not always, but very often. So the bank's role as a supporter of scale-up funding for fast-growing companies in Scotland is an important one when it comes to creating successful, large-scale, multinational, international companies based in Scotland and anchored in Scotland.
Okay, but I think as a committee, we've been interested in the balance between those bigger transnational corporation investments and investments in small and medium-sized enterprises. Yeah. And I think the figure quoted in the report was supplied to the Auditor General by the bank, which said 92.3% of all investments were in SMEs, which didn't sound right because we know about Gresham House Forestry and we know about Quantum at Ardisir and so on. So I think we've arrived at a figure which is nearer to a 60-40 balance between SMEs and non-SMEs for investment. I don't know whether you can verify that or not.
I can't comment on those figures. I think that would be for the bank, but just from your explanation, it may be it's the differences between the scale of investment and the number of investment. But I think that's something that the bank would be best placed to help you with.
Mr. Ross.
I think across the portfolio, and I think as Greg is suggesting, the nature of the larger investments, so clearly Ardisir is a very large investment and bringing in quite a lot of international capital against that portfolio of smaller businesses, which tend to be just shifting, I guess, from early stage into growth. So the nature of those investments is they're usually in the sort of 2 to 10 million range.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to invite Colin Beattie to put some questions to you now. Colin.
Thank you, Convener. First, I'd like to pick up on one of the responses there to the convener's questions. You talked about SNIB having responsibility or a task to bring in private capital to be used along with the public capital. Now, by the very nature of the bank, it's going to be going into higher risk investments. Now, it must be a bit of a task to bring in private investors where you're partially at least focused on encouraging and bringing through high-risk companies. Now, that will either reflect in pricing to match that risk, or an inability to get private investors to come in. How do you see that being managed?
So I think the very fact that the bank is willing to invest in certain areas, including individual companies, but in some cases in projects, the fact that the bank is willing to invest may be sufficient in itself to give comfort to other investors.
But you're not giving any guarantees.
You're not giving any guarantees, but you're committing your own investment, your own money to that particular entity, and that in itself sends a signal to other investors. And that, in some circumstances, may be sufficient to swing the investment decision for those other investors.
Up to a point, that's true. From my own experience in the industry, it doesn't often work like that. people are encouraged, if government or other institutions are putting money in, that encourages you in. But at the end of the day, they have to look at the project. And if the project's a high-risk project, it's still a high-risk project, even if others are prepared to risk their capital.
Oh, I fully agree with that. So
Expectations shouldn't be too high on the.
Well, I think this is where the skill of the investment team at SNB and good processes really matter, because they have to identify where they can make a commercial return. That's a requirement of the bank, but also where they can have most impact. So you're right. There are some entities who might have no difficulty in raising private finance, in which case the role for SNB there might be less clear-cut in terms of its ability to progress its mission through investing in that entity, if it would otherwise be successful in attracting commercial finance. There are others where, frankly, it's just too risky. So actually the bank won't invest in private sector, participants won't invest. But then there are certainly areas where the very act that the bank is willing to invest, that can give comfort to other investors, and that can encourage them to co-invest with the bank. And that the bank is, as I'm sure you heard from the chair and from the chief executive in June, they're keen to sort of really develop different ways in which they can sort of work with other investors so that they can really get the most out of that co-investment model. I do think there's another important element here, which is the requirement that the bank makes a commercial rate of return. Some people might ask, well, why? Should the bank offer funding on sort of sub-commercial terms, so essentially subsidise investment? I think that argument around the signal that it sends to other private investors and encouraging them to co-invest is weaker in those circumstances, because there is something quite powerful in the bank as a commercial investor, albeit with a target rate of return which is lower than purely private investment funds would have. But the bank is a commercial investor willing to commit its capital to certain projects and investments. That in itself tells you about the due diligence process that the bank has gone through and the assessment of its investment professionals and its willingness to commit to that particular operation. And I think this is part of, this is, in my view, this is a well-crafted model that we have for the bank that needs to be kept under review. And again, I'll point to the 5-year review as being an opportunity to examine success in different areas. And we always need to be open to the evolution of this. But that sort of balance, we've talked about balance in a number of different areas. I think it's important here too.
If the bank's operating on a purely commercial basis, then some of the investments would have to reflect the risk in terms of the interest rates and so on charged, which would defeat some of the objective of being able to invest in these companies and encourage them to come on, because the interest rates and so on would be penal, and the fees attached to it. So presumably there must be an element of flexibility in SNB being able to set the rates and so on at what would maybe be below a commercial rate, in order to be able to have that company able to afford to take the loan or whatever.
I'll bring in Andy in a moment, but I think it's important to recognise that the target rate of return for the bank is 3 to 4%, which is below what a typical investment fund would seek by way of target rate of return. And while the bank is required to make a commercial return, it's also a mission-based investor. So it's both making a commercial return and pursuing a mission. But Andy, you might want to comment.
Just maybe before you come in, Andy, maybe you can answer this. If then, the logic you're using there indicates that, in fact, in high-risk circumstances, the bank would seek perhaps not a commercial rate of return, or it seeks a commercial rate of return which would, in a way, scare off some of the other investors.
So the point I would add in relation to that is, when we're talking about crowding in finance from other private sector investors. The bank need not always invest on the exact same terms as other investors. So, for example, the bank could take a particularly long-term patient view of returns. And in doing so and investing in that, it may bring in other sources of finance with their own rate of return and their own objectives. So there's almost catalysing that kind of wider private finance by taking those sort of positions. That doesn't necessarily mean they're not commercial in their own right. It just means they take a particular view of that commerciality in line with their target rate of return, in line with their impact priorities, and in line with their kind of investment decision making for them. And I think so that's one point I'd add. The second is, and in given evidence, the Chair made this point. One of the reasons why they pursued the Stage 1 FCA approvals was because it allows them to give that advice in the market to others. And actually, the work they're doing with some of the other investors, bringing together different parties and encouraging collaboration across those investors, could be construed as advice. So there's almost a structuring element to what the bank can bring as well as just the direct investment.
Which leads me to another point. If they're giving advice to other parties, how is that conflict between the fact that they're not actually a fully commercial operation and they are offering a mission? How does that conflict with giving advice to private investors?
That'll be under the terms of the bank's authorisations they have from the Financial Conduct Authority. So they have already pursued and secured in January of this year Stage 1 authorisations. So they will have shared all that information with the relevant regulators and have the right processes in place to make sure they can satisfy both public sector reporting requirements and also regulatory requirements.
It sounds to me like there's a few conflicts in there that have not been worked out. Anyway, let me move on and not pursue that. Funding arrangements, which is quite important for the bank. Historically, the bank wasn't able to use income, or it had to use income in the same financial year. And of course, single-year capital allocations from the Scottish Government are quite difficult to align with a properly commercial activity. Now, the Scottish Government's response to that was to give them £25 million of under and overspend to next year. Now, when the bank gave evidence to the committee, they said they welcomed it, but that it did not go as far as they thought it needed. Why was that?
This is one of the elements that we need to put in place to allow the bank to operate fully as a perpetual fund.
The 25 million has been agreed. What were the bits that weren't agreed?
Well, I think so. Year-end flexibility is important. Multi-year funding settlements are also important as part of that. We need to do that in a way which fits with the rules and the financial environment that financial institutions operate under within the UK system. We've just had the UK spending review completed. That provides a basis for the Scottish spending review, which will be undertaken at the end of this year, and that provides a vehicle for getting into the question of multi-year settlements. We could get into some of the details on the complexities around that if you would find it helpful.
Is it only multi-year flexibility that was not agreed? Is that the only issue?
For the perpetual fund?
From the point of view of the of SNIB.
So when it comes to
just to repeat, SNIB said that they welcomed the flexibility of the 25 million, but they noted it did not go as far as is needed, and they used the word needed, not wanted. So what is it that's missing? What is the piece that's missing from this?
Do you want me to come? So I think in an ideal world, what the bank would like to be this perpetual fund would be that increased flexibility across financial years. They want to be able to keep and reinvest their gains on investments across financial years.
And that's understandable.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be normal commercial activity.
And as part of that, they want to be able to absorb their own losses around, for example, some of the examples we've spoken about.
I'm sure the government would want that as well.
Yep.
But what were was that the only issue that was under discussion, or were there other issues where you were unable to agree to what they were asking for?
So I think those that sort of description of what the bank would ideally want, I think the Auditor General's report is clear that some of that is dependent on the UK government as well as the Scottish government. And
no, except this about the multi-year settlement and all the rest of it. I mean, there has to be alignment with what the UK government is doing and so on, just from the way things are. But what were the needs that the bank had that were not met, other than that particular multi-year settlement?
So at the minute, the bank would like to be able to reinvest all its returns, which it will start to. Those returns will start to appear over the next 3 to 4 years. At the minute, the financial rules within the Scottish Public Finance Manual, the Consolidated Budget Guidance, which are a combination of Scottish and UK government rules, prevent us from providing that to the bank. And we're working both internally and with the UK government to try and address that.
Okay, I'll leave that point. Historically, SNIB has been funded through financial transactions, mainly. Yeah. And they are, of course, running out. But I'm interested in just getting a grip of how the repayments work. Now, from the Scottish Government's point of view, they're only required to refund about 80% of the financial transactions, if I recall correctly, and I'm talking from memory here. But where a repayment is made to SNIB that is related to financial transactions, they must immediately make that payment to the Scottish Government, is my understanding. Now, how are you managing that?
Andy. I think Andy can.
And how does that impact on the 25 million, if at all?
So I'll come in first on this one, which is on the point about financial transactions allocations. Over the last few years, all we've had at the Scottish Government is an annual allocation of financial transactions and no forward certainty over how much we'll get the following year and how much will be beyond that. I think what the UK Spending Review did a few months ago was give us a 5-year outlook of those financial transactions, and the profile is increasing. So the amount of financial transactions allocated to Scottish Government will rise to about 360 million or thereabouts by the end of the spending review period. So that, for the first time, gives us some longer-term visibility on the amount of FTs coming to Scottish Government. On your point about repayments, that is for, it's not the bank that directly exchanges with Treasury on that. It is for Scottish Government to agree a repayment plan with the UK Government and the HM Treasury on financial transactions, of which colleagues in Exchequer and Finance have agreed that repayment plan over the longer term. Now, that reflects a longer term. It also reflects the fact that we are able to use underspends in financial transactions in previous years to make increased payments in previous years, therefore reducing payments in future years. So it's not as straightforward as every year the bank has to repay a set amount. It's a longer term agreement between Scottish and UK Government.
So just 2 points there. Firstly, financial transactions do not affect at all the 25 million fixed flexibility. And secondly, repayments from lending, which has been backed by financial transactions, that doesn't have to go back to the Scottish Government right away. That's just part of the
longer-term repayment plan between Scottish Government and UK Government.
Okay, that's clear.
Just to add to that, so this financial year, the bank will have FT income, coming back of around £7 million, and we've agreed with the bank that they can reinvest that this financial year. But as I was saying earlier, they can't move it apart from within the 25 million flex across financial years.
Okay.
Mr. Beattie, I wonder if it might be helpful just to explain. So that £25 million mechanism, the way in which that operates is the bank is obviously, it gets its budget allocation each year, and the question becomes, given the uncertainty of the timing of investment decisions, whether the bank is able or wants to, in fact, to commit those funds during the year, or whether it may be better to allow that to slip into the following year. And that's why that specific mechanism has been created. We need to use part of the Scotland Reserve, essentially, in order to be able to provide that mechanism, and that reduces financial flexibility elsewhere for the Scottish Government. So that is the trade-off that we make when it comes to the size of that facility. There's a separate issue which is around being able to reinvest returns on investments, which can come in the form of revenue or capital, and also the requirement for the bank to be able to reabsorb losses. Now, the two are related, but it is a separate issue. And you do then get into sort of difficult issues around what's permissible in terms of the rules, which are partly established by Scottish Government, but also reflect the UK Government approach and the UK Government framework. Now, against this context, a lot is changing at the UK level. So it's partly about the spending review, but it's partly also about the Puffins designation, this new system that's been created in the Financial Transactions Control Framework, which has been put in place alongside that. That wasn't... Scottish Government wasn't consulted in that. It doesn't apply to the Scottish Government, but there's a great deal of work that's underway to work constructively with the UK Government to explore what's possible in terms of enabling Scottish National Investment Bank to potentially benefit from some of those flexibilities. These are complex issues because they also impact on the governance of the bank, because the way in which those new frameworks have been established, it's very much done on the basis of how UK government institutions such as the National Wealth Fund, the British Business Bank, how the sort of governance structures that they operate within, so accountable to the UK Parliament, audited by the National Audit Office rather than Audit Scotland. So there's a number of issues there that we're trying to work with, we're trying to work through together, including with the UK Government. There are some issues we can pursue independently of UK Government. We're absolutely determined to do that. Spending review process will be helpful in that regard, but there are other issues where we have to work it through with UK Government and see what's possible.
Let me just tie up this question of the 25 million. I assume that you're going to be reviewing it from time to time to make sure it is the solution that you think it is.
I think we would, yes, I think we keep that under review.
How often?
So I take just that. So we're in essentially regular dialogue with the bank, and we have discussions with them about their financial needs across the year. And particularly as they get into the third, fourth quarter of each year, assessing what flexibility they need at this point. That 25 million is the maximum that we're able to provide. But I think we'll keep that under review, and it will partly depend on the extent to which our discussions with the UK Government around some of those flexibilities can make progress as well.
Okay. We've been talking about the bank becoming a perpetual fund, which has obviously got lots of advantages all around. You're clearly in discussions with the Treasury over this, presumably on a regular basis.
So there are ongoing discussions at ministerial and official level. Richard, you may be able to say more about how that works in practice. It absolutely involves our Exchequer and Finance colleagues because it's part of broader engagement with UK Government. Do you have any timescale under which you expect these discussions to be completed? I think it's... Richard?
So, not at this point. I would say Exchequer colleagues lead on this with UK Government and Treasury because it's part of the overall fiscal framework, fiscal discussions. There were discussions with the previous Chief Secretary to the Treasury, which all devolved governments participated in, which were essentially around the extent to which the financial control framework for financial transactions and this designation of institutions as public finance institutions, the extent to which that can apply to devolved bodies. And I guess where we've got to is, again, the then previous Chief Secretary of the Treasury has agreed to open a dialogue on that and to look at the implications of that control framework and the designation of puffins for the devolved administrations.
So assuming that there's a successful move to the bank becoming a perpetual fund, would you anticipate it would require any structural changes within the bank, or is it simply a technical change actually?
I think most of those, at this point, our sort of analysis of this is that most of those changes are around the financial arrangements between the Scottish Government and the UK Government and the extent to which this puffin status could apply to the bank. We don't, I think the committee had a discussion on this last time around, whether legislation changes would be needed. At this point, we don't think that, but if, for example, as we work this through, there's needed changes to the Articles of Association with the bank, then a legislative change would be needed to achieve that.
Okay, just to move on, there's obviously going to be different profile of public finance risks if the bank becomes a perpetual fund. So there are going to have to be some discussions, at least between yourself and SNIB, as to how those public finance risks are going to be managed.
Well, I think you've identified a core issue, which is precisely that, the public finance risk that may be created, but it's also linked to the question of how we approach meeting the requirements for SNIB to become a perpetual fund. And, we've rightly sort of focused on puffin status. That may be the solution, or it may be part of the solution, or it might not be the solution. Because there are other ways in which flexibilities can be given by the UK government to the Scottish Government that then allows us to manage those public finance risks and therefore to do what we want to do by way of allowing SNIB to become a perpetual fund. Now, I mention that because there are a number of moving parts there, some of which we can control, but quite a few we don't control. But we're engaging constructively, obviously, with our Exchequer and Finance colleagues and alongside them and through them with UK Government to try and ensure that we get that right. But management of public finance risks is obviously the core perspective that our Exchequer colleagues will take on this question.
So what's plan B? If the UK Government doesn't agree to any measures that would effectively make the bank a perpetual fund, what's plan B? How are you going to give it the flexibility it needs?
So I guess this is why we are, I guess Audit Scotland's recommendation was government needs to understand this and then set out a plan. And I think this is the kind of basis for our plan. Our plan is threefold. One is to use the forthcoming Scottish spending review to make sure we give the bank the multi-year certainty it needs to give it the greatest ability to manage the forecast income and losses and to use that end-year flexibility and build that on a sustainable and enduring basis. So that's step one of the plan. Step two is to understand how that financial control framework might apply to devolved governments, Scottish Government and others. And in doing so, we need to understand the implications of if it does apply directly or if it doesn't. So if it applies and there's a practical way we can make it work, then that might give us a route through designation of the bank as a puffin to apply some flexibilities, so different treatment of income and losses, different treatment of end-year budgeting. I guess if it's deemed that the application of that financial control framework to Scotland is not appropriate, we may have to look at other mechanisms using things like the Scotland Reserve. But to do that, you would require likely a larger increase in the Scotland Reserve to give us the flexibility and capacity to manage those year-to-year changes. So there are different routes we can go at each step of this. But I think the next stage is crucially understanding how that financial control framework might apply to Scotland. And the next milestone on that is there is a finance interministerial discussion between UK Government and Scottish Government coming up in October, where that will be one of the areas on one of the issues on the agenda.
Let me ask you one last question, simple one. What happens? We've been talking about, my colleague Graham Simpson here has been talking about potential losses and so on. What happens if there are losses that the bank can't manage within its budget cover, and how are you managing that in relation to public risk to public finances? Presumably the government stands behind the bank.
Yes. What essentially happens is losses and gains are offset against each other. And if losses are greater than gains, then that comes back. It comes back to my budget, essentially. And we need to manage that working with the finance team to ensure that that's done in a way which can be accommodated in the best possible way within the Scottish Government's budget.
But at the moment, do you have something in your management of the risks in relation to this? I mean, you must have a view.
Indeed. Well, so very clearly having sight of gains as well as losses is an important part of the financial management process, offsetting those against each other. But if losses are greater than gains, that does come back and it impacts on the portfolio budget. But there are many sort of moving parts and uncertain elements in that budget. And of course, as part of good budget management, during any financial year, we will be able to offset different elements. So that's the approach we take.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, I mean, I don't want to labour this point, but just for clarity, my understanding in reading the Auditor General's report and then in the exchanges that we had with the chair of the bank back in June was that the Treasury was undertaking a review, a kind of discrete exercise in looking at the rules and possibly the legislative framework around which these public finance institutions, which are presumably the puffings you're talking about, are. So the National Wealth Fund, etc. Has there been a discrete review that has started and has been completed and has made recommendations, and the Chancellor or the Treasury officials are now musing over those, or have they decided? Or what? Because when Mr Rawson was asked about the timetable by Mr Beattie, it was all a bit woolly. And the recommendation in the report is, you know, within 3 months of those recommendations, action should be taken.
Yeah. So I think it's probably more accurate to describe it as a process rather than an event.
Okay.
But progress has been made by UK government in that process, but we're still engaging with them in the question of whether and how this may change the context within which we operate in Scotland. And I should say it's not just in Scotland. The Puffins model and the new FT controls framework, it doesn't apply to any of the devolved administrations. So that interministerial group that Andy referred to, that brings together all of the devolved finance ministers with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, if I remember correctly. So the UK government has announced the new approach for certain public finance institutions, very clearly designated. So that's British Business Bank, British International Fund, National Wealth Funds, National Housing Bank, and UK Export Finance. Those are the puffins. It set out criteria by which they are designated, and it set out a new financial control framework within which they will operate. There are still some elements of that which I think are not clear to us, but at the moment it very explicitly does not apply to Scottish or Welsh institutions.
But are you lobbying so that it does apply to them?
That's where it becomes quite complicated.
Well, it's a yes or no. What's the Scottish Government's position?
We're exploring what's possible in that regard. And as I say, some of the ways in which the...
That's less than clear, isn't it?
It's an honest, straightforward answer. And let me explain why. There are some aspects of that framework which don't readily apply to the Scottish National Investment Bank. So the Scottish National Investment Bank is obviously established under an act of the Scottish Parliament, and I've already referred to the role that Audit Scotland plays, auditing the accounts of the Scottish National Investment Bank. So the framework specifically, for the puffins specifically, refers to the role of the National Audit Office and the role of the UK Parliament. So there are some very specific areas where it's not directly applicable to SNIB. So this is what we need to explore. We need to understand what's possible, and that's the process that we're engaged in just now.
And are you going to meet the 3-month timetable set out in the Auditor General's recommendation?
So that process is. I would say that process is undergoing that process of review. So I must admit, we do find it quite hard to date exactly when the clock should start on meeting that 3-month deadline. But because that process of establishing that framework is still ongoing, it's not an event.
But I'm still none the wiser whether the Scottish Government's position is they want the Scottish National Investment Bank to be a perpetual investment fund or not.
That's our position.
So I guess what I would add to it is that is our position. That is the stated position of the bank, and when we set up the bank, that it should act like a perpetual investment fund and have the benefits of those types of flexibilities. Now, I think the complexity we've got here about the timing is the financial control framework is exactly what it says. It is a control framework that the UK government has put in place to control spend that under its remit, if you like. So its own institutions like the National Wealth Fund, like the British Business Bank, are currently working through how do they apply to what controls are in place as a result of them, what flexibilities might they get access to as a result of being applicable to this framework. I guess we've got the additional layer here of Scottish Government to understand the starting point was it doesn't apply to devolved governments. We've got to make sure that in applying it to devolved governments, it doesn't impact wider financial pressures or considerations. So there's just that first stage. We've got to understand, will it apply to us in an effective way before we then think about what are the benefits.
OK, well, thanks, Mr Hogg. I'm going to now move on to the questions that the Deputy Convener's got. Jamie, over to you.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, gentlemen. I've got a few areas to cover, so I'll just get cracking. Mr Irwin, can you just describe, for the benefit of me or the committee, where you fit into the equation in terms of lines of accountability or oversight of SNIB?
So I am the Portfolio Accountable Officer. That's my primary responsibility. As I've explained already, I have a formal role engaging with the Senior Independent Director on a quarterly basis. We have a newly appointed Senior Independent Director. She conducts the performance review of the Chair. That's one of her roles. Another role that she has is if there are any tensions between the bank and the Scottish Government, she is the person through which we seek to resolve those tensions. I'm also, Richard and Andy are part of my team, and I work with them as they exercise their responsibilities. Richard as our observer on the boards, and Andy as the head of the sponsor team.
OK, thank you for that. Would it be a fair assumption to state that the day-to-day operations and decisions made by the bank are operational matters made by the bank, including day-to-day investment decisions, and that your role, representing government, would be to manage the risk to the public purse rather than the day-to-day risk to the bank?
Certainly operational decisions are for the bank. That's what operational independence means, and the bank should manage its own risks, including its investment risks. We need to be satisfied that the bank is doing that within in a manner which is consistent with its obligations under the relevant legislation, also the framework document that we've agreed with them, and that it's following good practice more generally in key areas, including risk management.
So I guess what I'm getting at is, in your role as the principal accountable officer, do you personally have any statutory duty or responsibilities to manage risk to the public finance of the bank? And by that, and let me give you an example, what was your reaction to the news that the bank had posted or announced £77 million of unrealised losses, although we know that figure will subsequently change. Perhaps some of it may even be realised, unfortunately. But how would you react to that?
So as an accountable officer, I'm responsible to Parliament for regular, proper value for money use of public funds. And certainly from that perspective, yes, I have responsibilities, specific responsibilities regarding the bank. We have a clear governance framework for the bank. It's been set up in a particular way to allow it to have operational independence. I of course, am acutely aware of that outturn for the bank this year. I'm also aware, if you look at National Wealth Fund, British Business Bank, similar institutions, they've reported significant losses in some years and large gains in others. I do think it's important to take very seriously the process that Audit Scotland have just gone through and the assurance that they can provide, as well as the recommendations that they make. And I do think that we need to take a sufficiently long-term and broad perspective in evaluating the financial performance of the bank. So I think the 5-year review is important in that regard.
All of that's very diplomatic. But what was your gut reaction? I mean, give me some adjectives. How did you feel when you saw the numbers?
So I think that's precisely the sort of area where I'm careful to be drawn into, because I think there's a risk that if I provide a commentary on the outturn in specific years or specific investments, that compromises the bank's operational independence. But I take very seriously my responsibilities as accountable officer, but I hope I've explained the way in which I see those as being undertaken.
You have. Do you think that because obviously the bank does have to conform to government set missions, if you like, or thematic areas where it expects the bank to invest in. At the moment, that's 50% in the net zero space, 50% in this vague term, was it place or people or something like that, and 25% in innovation. Do you think that's the right balance? Do you think that's the right mix? Because those are government set missions, not bank described ones, if you like.
Yes. Richard may be able to. Richard would have been involved in the setting of those missions, so you may be able to put them into context. Part
of, and I think it's actually within the legislation that the government sets the missions for the bank, and there's consultation on that. The missions that we set at the outset for the bank, which are long-term and, as you sort of suggested, are quite wide-ranging. They are still in place at this point. We've got no intention to change those missions. The bank reports on those missions through its impact report, so which is all published and transparent, so they can report on their progress towards those missions. And I think they are always reviewing, I guess, the mix, across the missions, but also the mix of different investments to try and hit their target rate of return as well.
Okay, I mean, to be fair to the bank, looking at their target versus actual, they're pretty bang on. So 50% is the target for net zero, and 50% of their investments are net zero. 25 in place, sitting around 26%, and innovation around 23%. So they're not far off that. But by default, by having those predetermined percentages of investments in different types of portfolios, is that perhaps restrictive on the bank? Is it actually inhibiting its ability, for example, to invest more in housing, which is presumed would sit in the place section, or more in technology and innovation, which would sit in the other quartile?
I think maybe just to go back to what I was saying earlier, the nature of the investments in net zero compared to the innovation investments means that in general terms, not exclusively, but in general terms, they're larger investments. So it doesn't take many RDCs to be an important part of your portfolio. I think that mix is about right at the minute,
Okay.
but the bank are always reviewing that.
Have you had any feedback from the bank as to whether they would prefer to rearrange that
No.
balance, if you like?
No.
They're quite happy with it?
Yeah.
Okay. Can I ask about subsidy control? It wouldn't be the first and probably won't be the last time that when a government intervenes in a sector that there are always concerns around market distortion. My understanding is that the three main tests for the government to intervene in the market is where the government should be able to demonstrate that this is an area of market failure, that the investee has been unable to secure private finance, and of course that the terms and conditions of the government intervention do not undercut the normal private market, if you like, and it's difficult to describe that. I think the words that the Auditor General uses is the bank does not undercut private market operators, and we can interpret that as you like. What oversight does the Scottish Government perform to ensure that the investments that STIB make are all subject to subsidy control assessments?
So that's the role of the board,
Right.
to ensure that the bank is complying with relevant legislation, and that would include subsidy control legislation.
Okay. Are you comfortable that that is the case in all investments?
Well, we have observer status on the boards. I suppose I would also observe that without wanting to get too drawn into the detail, that the bank does operate on a commercial basis. As Andy has noted, it is a long-term patient capital investor, which might mean that it does things that other investors are not willing to do, but it still operates on a commercial basis. And of course, one of the key tests of whether you're complying with subsidy control legislation is whether you pass the commercial market operator test, and the way in which SNIB has been set up. Again, without wanting to get too drawn into the detail, I think that should provide some confidence that this is not obviously a major issue for the bank.
Okay. I mean, you say it operates as a private bank, but it's public money, effectively. So there obviously are complications there.
The commercial market operator test is that you act as you make decisions in a similar way to a commercial market operator in the same circumstances, even if you're not a commercial market operator.
Perhaps to add, and I think it's in the Auditor General's report, is as part of their investment process, as they work their way through from a potential investment to an investment decision, absolutely testing as part of their due diligence process whether what they're proposing to do is subsidy control compliant as part of that process.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. My understanding is that today the bank has not exercised its right to exit an investment in a profitable manner. Indeed, most exits have been forced upon due to losses or administration of its investments. Are you comfortable that there are robust exit strategies within the bank?
Colleagues may want to add to this, but I suppose I'm not surprised by that. I think, given that the bank is now in its 5th year of operation, given that it is a long-term patient capital investor, given that the nature of investment is losses tend to be realised more quickly than successful exits. If you're a long-term patient capital investor and you've invested in a successful entity, you may well choose to remain committed to subsequent investments with that investee. So I don't have any concerns, and I'm not particularly surprised by that. But again, I think this is the sort of issue that would be explored as part of the 5-year review.
Okay, that's fine. Sorry, I'm rattling through questions because I do have to leave at 11. So I'm perfectly comfortable with the short responses. Not everyone needs to reply. So at the last session, something new came up, and that's something else that's been reported in the media over the last few months, and that's the fact that one of the entities under the bank, Scottish Investments Limited, has secured phase 1 approval from the FCA, effectively to become an investment vehicle to manage third-party capital and consolidating investments. I don't know whether that's something to be concerned about or something to be excited about. Could you clarify that?
I think it's something we support, and we've actively supported the bank in that. So Andy's already referred to it. It received first stage FCA authorisation on the 7th of January. And it is an important step to allow the bank to make progress to managing third-party capital alongside capital from the Scottish Government. That's one of the ways in which the bank can have more impact. It's a pretty intensive process. It has required the support of the Scottish Government. I believe we provided a letter to the FCA of support in July 2022 in support of that application. And we've had to make some, I suppose, relatively modest but important changes, such as agreeing to increase the minimum amount of cash held by the bank in order to meet the FCA's regulatory capital requirements. But that's an ongoing process. You need to get through to stage 3 authorisation before you can manage third-party funds.
Why do you think the bank wants to do this? Is it not venturing far away from its original construct as an entity?
I think it's about impact. I think this would be a model that would allow the bank to operate, yes, at scale with Scottish capital provided by the Scottish Government, but being able to manage third-party funds would enable the bank to have additional impact.
And will that increase the risk to the public purse? So, for example, if you have a publicly owned vehicle which is taking money from external sources and they make an investment, that investment goes bust and there are considerable losses, what exposure does that pose to the public purse? So
without wanting to get drawn into technical detail that I'm perhaps not the right person to respond to, there's a distinction between leveraged investment by the bank, which would be risky, and co-investment by managing third-party funds, which is essentially arranging to bring investment in alongside your investment, and that is less risky.
If I just may add another point for clarity, again, we touched on it earlier. So the FCA authorisation the bank has at this point of time is around that provision of advice relating to specific investments that they might be working on. They do not have FCA authorisation at this point to manage third-party capital. No. That would be something they would need to work towards. Stage
3's third-party capital, but that's significant, and it's also helpful because it changes the way in which the bank is able to interact with other investors, and as I say, this is important in terms of the bank being able to have impact.
Absolutely. Just to clarify that, would that mean at that stage the bank theoretically, or that arm of the bank theoretically, could not just co-invest but borrow capital to invest?
The bank at this point isn't able to borrow.
No, but
from
could
any
it,
apart from the
could it go down that road if it chose to?
So it would require a change to the shareholder framework document and the delegations between the Scottish Government and the bank.
Do you think any of this is a bit distracting, given that the scale of the losses that are being reported and the increase in annual losses?
I think this is part of very carefully thought through, deliberate work by the bank to position itself in a well-managed way with risks properly controlled to have maximum impact.
Okay, and I'll finish on just two very brief questions. One is the wider discussion that you may have followed in the last session. I had an interest in the bank supporting small businesses, not necessarily start-ups. I appreciate that's not its remit, but certainly anecdotal feedback is that smaller investment sums have been very difficult to come by from the bank. And of course, those are often the duties of other parts of government investment, Business Gateway, enterprise agencies and so on, but very much when they say no and the private market says no and the big banks say no, is there a perception that people can come to SNIB and get funding at the lower levels? And by that I mean perhaps less than $500,000, for example. It seems very much to be geared at the higher end of the market, and I think the investment portfolio seems to support that practice. Do you think there's a missed opportunity here to support small businesses in Scotland through what is a publicly owned bank?
Actually, again, going back to some of the discussion around the Business Investment Group, I think we're clear that Scottish Enterprise is the sort of primary vehicle for that early stage investment, but early stage with, with quite high growth potential. And if you look through some of the bank's investments, sometimes they are following on from investments that Scottish Enterprise has made. So in broad terms, the bank is, I think you're right, looking at investments over 2 million. Occasionally it will step down from that, but it's Scottish Enterprise that is in that early stage growth investment. That's their role, and we're quite keen to delineate that so that there isn't confusion.
That's just wasn't a criticism, it's just a question. And last but not least, there's been a lot of discussion, rightfully so, in the media around the level of pay and bonuses in public bodies. I'm sure you've been following debates the Parliament and this committee have had in recent weeks around this very issue. In the year 23-24, £865,000 was paid in bonuses. The outgoing Chief Executive's package was £340,000. The Chief Financial Officer's package was £240,000. These are way and above beyond normal public sector pays, and for all the reasons I think we understand. But do you appreciate the public's concern about the scale of bonuses being paid whilst losses are also taking place?
So I think it's absolutely right that there should be full scrutiny of pay and rewards across all public bodies. SNIB is, of course, subject to the government's pay policy. The approach that's taken at SNIB, it does align with other UK development banks, although I think if you make direct comparisons with those UK development banks, the pay and reward package at SNIB is lower. The institution operates on a different scale, so perhaps that is appropriate. The long-term investment plan is very carefully constructed, and there's also a very clearly set out process for ensuring that both the different elements in that plan and the weightings that are given to them and how success against those elements is judged, that it's done in an appropriate way, full transparency by people who don't participate in the plan, with appropriate involvement of ministers. But when you look at the different elements of that plan, 25% on demonstrating and enabling impact, 40% on delivering investment, 10% on targeting financial sustainability, and so on. There are different elements. I won't go into detail, but it's done in a balanced way, and it is about both impact aligned to its missions, and it is about development of the bank as an institution, and it is about financial performance as well. But where the bank is not successful in meeting those criteria, obviously that the payments are adjusted accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking in the real world, if I had a business unit that was losing millions of pounds, I wouldn't be getting a bonus. Again, just to underline the importance of, I think the bank would be criticised. Already noted that a development bank, particularly one in the stage of development that the Scottish National Investment Bank is at, it will report losses in some years, as National Wealth Fund, British Business Bank did, and it will report operational profits in other years as well. I think if the long-term investment plan was purely based on that financial performance, then that would rightly come under criticism. It's also based on targets are set for development of the bank as an institution, and very importantly, the impact that the bank has against its mission, so not just financial performance. That's very helpful. Did you, just out of interest, did you personally have any exit interviews with any of the outgoing chief executives of the bank? They've had quite a high rate of turnover. Does that cause any room for concern as the sponsor element of the government, given what's happening in some other public bodies and the turnover rates at chief executives?
So I've certainly met with the chief executive, the current outgoing chief executive, and I've had an informal conversation. I wouldn't describe it as a formal exit interview we will absolutely comply with best practice within the Scottish Government in that regard, and that's something that, if we need to, we'll give further consideration to. Al Denham was appointed soon after I joined, and it was the interim chief executive who was in position when I joined the Scottish Government, so I wasn't in this current position when the previous chief executive left.
Okay, but you've got no concerns?
I'm very satisfied with the process by which Al Denham was appointed and the development of the bank under his tenure, and the process that the bank is going through now to seek an appointment now that Al has decided that he wants to retire from the position.
That's fine. Thank you. 11 o'clock. Convener. Thank you.
Okay, and the Deputy Convener may need to leave us. I'm just on that last point. I mean, Mr Denham, I think, announced on the 10th of April that he was planning to step down, and it's the 10th of September today, so that's 5 months later. What stage is the bank at in the recruitment of his replacement?
So the bank is working towards the end of that process. It's gone through a recruitment process. It's trying to identify the right candidate for the post. For transparency, I'm part of that interview process. Yeah. That interview process is ongoing at the minute, so it will come to a conclusion quite soon.
But do you expect by the 6-month mark, the 10th of October, that there will be an announcement about who the new Chief Executive Officer for the Scottish National Investment Bank is going to be?
I can't give you a guarantee by that date, but I would expect it to be over the next couple of months. And it might depend on discussions with whichever individual is chosen.
Why did it take so long? I mean, the announcement was made in April that he was standing down. In order, I think Mr Denham was very generous in saying that he would hang around to make sure there was a transition and he was in no rush to get out of the door and so on. But you might even be trying his patience if you're saying it's another couple of months before somebody's going to be imposed.
He's a very patient man.
Yes, patient capital and patient men and all. But I'm just, on a serious note,
I understand.
You know, for the good operation of the bank and for the leadership of the bank to be maintained, surely there should be a little bit more urgency and an understanding that, I mean, because presumably whoever's appointed may need to give notice to their current employer. Yeah. I mean, you could be looking at next year before someone's imposed.
And you know, I can't talk about individuals in this, sure. But whoever that may be, you know, there may be some discussion about, you know, if they're coming from out with Scotland, the nature of their contract, all of those things that are part and parcel of agreeing a contract of employment with someone. And that might just take a few extra weeks once that kind of decision is made.
I think we can all agree it's essential to get the right person in this role, and Richard has worked with the chair and others to ensure that we do that. Al Denham has also agreed to stay in post for longer than 6 months if necessary to ensure a smooth transition. So we have good arrangements in place to enable that.
Yeah. I mean, he did say to us that he had a 6-month notice period, and he announced on the 10th of April, 5 months ago, that he was going. So, I mean, I just think it's quite a long process. Of course, we recognise that we need to get the right person in position, but it does seem to be a heck of a long time. But anyway, I'm going to move on because I know Stephanie Callaghan, who's joining us online with us today, is itching to ask some questions. So, Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to the panel. Now, you've spoken about the bank's mission-led approach, ensuring that its investments deliver meaningful social, environmental and economic benefits, not just the financial returns. And these outcomes are central to achieving its 2030 impact ambitions across net zero, place and innovation. So I'm mindful of time, so just a couple of short questions around community engagement from me. Firstly, I'm interested in how does the SNIB engage with local communities to assess the social impact of place-based investments, like thriving investments, for example? And secondly, what feedback has the bank received from stakeholders on the effectiveness of its impact delivery? Thank you.
Well, I pick that up. If you take Thriving Investments as an example, but this applies across all their investments, there's a kind of process by which the bank, as part of the agreement of investment, are getting information from those companies or projects about the impact they are making. So whether that's net zero, jobs created, whatever it may be. The bank has an annual stakeholder survey. So it is getting, which I think was touched on in the Chairman, Chief Executive's evidence. So they're getting feedback every year across the broad range of their stakeholders. And then I think for sort of individual place-based investments, they're investing in a project, and they would expect that project to be engaging locally. But I can't speak for the bank, but it's the project that's kind of on the ground and engaging primarily here.
So can I ask then, what does the Scottish Government have in place to make sure that there is actually that direct engagement and feedback coming from people in those communities?
I think I would go back primarily to the stakeholder survey, and I think we also, to a degree, use the Ministerial Advisory Group as a way of, I guess, both getting intelligence, information, views from that cross-section of people on that group around the bank's performance. Some of them are perhaps closer to the sort of areas that you're talking about than others. And we do, and clearly ministers occasionally receive feedback as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Stephanie. I think that was the final questions that we had this morning. So with that, could I take this opportunity again to thank you, Director General, for the evidence that you've led this morning. Mr Hogg and Mr Rawson, you've both been very, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, you've been very comprehensive contributors, so we thank you very much indeed for the evidence that you've given us. It's been very informative. And with that, I am now going to move the committee into private session, and thanks once again. Thank you.